break economic alliances with the U.S., go with China. The president has threatened a 100% tariff. What impact would that have?
It would be a disaster for Canada. I was in the Oval with the president today. He spoke to Prime Minister Carney, who was very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos. And Sean, I'm not sure what the Prime Minister was thinking. Of course, Canada depends on the U.S. There's much more north-south trade than there could ever be east-west trade. He talks about middle countries having to do their own thing. And I'm old enough to remember.
The rupture didn't begin with a tariff threat or a stray insult. It began the moment Canada stopped flinching. At Davos, in a room designed for polite euphemisms and elite ambiguity, the Canadian Prime Minister said something that landed like a dropped glass. He described a world reorganizing itself around democratic resilience, while the United States, once the anchor of that order, was actively destabilizing it. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just clarity. And clarity in the Trump era is treated as an act of aggression. You could feel the shift immediately. Diplomats leaned forward. Investors recalibrated. Journalists stopped typing for half a second too long, because everyone in that room understood what was being implied. Leadership is not a birthright, and America was forfeiting it in real time. The response from Washington was not diplomacy. It was humiliation theater. Within hours, Trump-aligned officials flooded friendly media outlets with a story so brazen it almost sounded satirical. The claim was that the Canadian Prime Minister had personally called the Oval Office to apologize, to walk back his Davos remarks, to beg for forgiveness. Not a misunderstanding, not a disagreement, a submission narrative. The kind authoritarians always deploy when they're challenged publicly. If you can't refute the message, invent the surrender. But here's the problem with lies told at scale. They require discipline, and this one collapsed the moment Canada spoke again. The Prime Minister did not apologize. He did not retreat. He confirmed, calmly, deliberately, that he meant exactly what he said. Canada had recognized the shift in U.S. trade and foreign policy early, and it was responding by strengthening alliances abroad and investing at home. He described the conversation with the U.S. president as clear and constructive, which in diplomatic language means firm without flinching. No remorse, no backtracking, just a refusal to play the submissive role Washington had written for him. That should have been the end of it. In a functioning international system, disagreement leads to negotiation. Instead, the Trump orbit escalated because what followed was not about trade. It was about punishment. Almost immediately, the rhetoric shifted from economic pressure to something darker. The old joke about Canada as the 51st state stopped sounding like a joke. Surrogates began floating the idea of internal Canadian fracture, specifically Alberta, as if it were a geopolitical opportunity. Commentators mused aloud about independent-minded Albertans, about pipelines, about whether parts of Canada might be better off aligning more closely with the United States. This wasn't accidental, it wasn't improvised, it was textbook. Authoritarian regimes respond to resistance in 3 phases. First, denial. Pretend the resistance didn't happen or that it ended in capitulation. Second, delegitimization. Portray the resisting leader as reckless, extremist, or acting against their own people. And third, fragmentation. Identify internal fault lines and apply pressure until a sovereign state begins to crack from within. Russia did this in Georgia, in Moldova, in Ukraine's Donbass region. The language is always the same. You don't invade, you support local voices. You don't annex, you respect self-determination. You don't destabilize, you respond to grievances. Watching American officials flirt openly with this playbook against a Democratic ally is not just alarming, it's unprecedented. Alberta became the target because it fits the profile: resource-rich, politically polarized, governed by leadership willing to antagonize federal authority. It doesn't matter that separatist sentiment there is marginal. It never matters. What matters is plausibility, the creation of enough noise to manufacture a pretext. When U.S.-aligned figures began speculating publicly about Alberta holding a referendum, about pipelines being blocked by Canada rather than markets, about Alberta's natural partnership with the United States, the signal was unmistakable. Washington wasn't talking to Ottawa anymore. It was talking over Ottawa to regional discontent. That is foreign interference, full stop, and it exposes something deeper about the Trump worldview. To Trump, alliances are not partnerships, they are hierarchies. Sovereignty is tolerated only when it submits. The moment a smaller democracy asserts independence, it is treated not as an equal, but as a problem to be corrected. This is why the Davos speech mattered so much. It wasn't just a critique of U.S. policy, it was a demonstration of an alternative. Canada positioned itself as proof that liberal democracy can respond to coercion without collapsing into chaos or authoritarian mimicry. That is intolerable to a movement that survives on the idea that democracy is weak, decadent, and doomed. So the response escalated again, this time into information warfare. Disinformation surged across Canadian and U.S. social platforms, exaggerating Alberta separatism, inflating economic grievances, recycling familiar tropes about globalists, elites, and betrayed workers. The parallels to Brexit were impossible to miss. A marginal movement amplified through targeted messaging, fueled by resentment, and framed as a grassroots uprising rather than an externally encouraged destabilization. Here's the critical point. None of this requires a majority. It never has. Authoritarian destabilization succeeds by creating uncertainty, not consensus. If enough people believe a fracture is possible, markets react, allies hesitate, governments divert attention inward, the damage is done before a single vote is cast. And while this unfolds, the Trump administration frames its posture as defensive. Tariffs are described as leverage, threats as negotiation, insults as toughness. But toughness doesn't look like this. This looks like insecurity, weaponized. Legally, the implications are staggering. The United States is bound by treaty obligations to respect Canadian sovereignty, not merely in territorial terms, but in political independence. Encouraging or legitimizing separatist movements within an allied democracy violates the spirit and arguably the letter of those commitments. It undermines the post-World War II order that Washington itself designed, where borders are not bargaining chips and internal political disputes are not tools of foreign leverage. Domestically, it reveals something equally corrosive. A government willing to normalize foreign interference abroad is one step away from excusing it at home. You cannot argue that elections are sacred in Michigan while casually flirting with the destabilization of democratic processes in Alberta. The contradiction is not accidental, it is foundational. This is where pattern recognition becomes unavoidable. Trump does not see states, he sees properties, he does not see alliances. He sees transactions, and he does not see democratic legitimacy as something to be preserved, only as something to be exploited when it serves him and discarded when it doesn't. Canada's refusal to submit punctured that worldview, and the fury that followed exposed how thin the veneer of America First really is. This was never about American workers or sovereignty. It was about dominance, about ensuring that no neighboring democracy could succeed while rejecting Trumpism. That's why Canada suddenly became framed as a threat. Not militarily, not economically, ideologically. A stable, pluralistic, law-bound democracy standing firm next to an increasingly erratic United States is dangerous. Not to Americans, but to the narrative that authoritarian nationalism is inevitable. Canada's existence as a counterexample weakens the argument that chaos is the price of freedom. Which brings us to the climax of this story. The most dangerous moment is not a trade war. It is normalization. The normalization of American officials casually discussing the internal breakup of an allied nation. The normalization of comparing democratic leaders to wayward governors. The normalization of disinformation as a diplomatic tool. The normalization of humiliation as statecraft. Once that line is crossed, it does not snap back easily. History is clear on this point. Democratic erosion rarely announces itself with tanks. It arrives through language first, through jokes that stop being jokes, through hypotheticals that slowly become options, through the steady redefinition of what is acceptable to say, then to do. Canada recognized this early. That is why it diversified trade, why it strengthened ties with Europe and Asia, why it refused to be isolated or intimidated, and why ordinary Canadians responded with something Washington did not anticipate: collective economic resistance. Not riots, not threats, boycotts, civic action, the quiet, disciplined withdrawal of consent. That, more than any speech, is what triggered panic. Because authoritarian movements are brittle. They depend on spectacle, submission, and the illusion of inevitability. When a neighbor calmly says no and keeps functioning, the illusion cracks. So where does this go? In the short term, expect escalation. More rhetoric, more disinformation, more attempts to frame Canada's independence as recklessness, possibly more economic pressure disguised as policy. This is how wounded power behaves. In the medium term, watch Alberta, not as a secessionist threat, but as a stress test. If democratic institutions hold under pressure, the playbook fails. If they fracture, the damage will ripple far beyond Canada's borders. And in the long term, the implications are global. If the United States continues down this path, it will not merely lose allies. It will teach the world that American power is no longer anchored to rules, only to impulse. That lesson will be learned quickly and acted upon by regimes far less constrained than Canada. The tragedy is that this is not inevitable. The United States could choose a different course. It could recognize that leadership is earned through stability, not spectacle, through respect, not coercion, through consistency, not chaos. But that choice requires something Trumpism fundamentally rejects: restraint. What we are witnessing is not a diplomatic spat. It is a stress fracture in the democratic order, one exposed by a neighbor who refused to bend and a regime that could not tolerate being defied. History will remember moments like Davos not for the speeches themselves, but for the reactions they provoked. Calm words met with reckless fury, democratic confidence met with authoritarian impulse. And the question now is not whether Canada will hold. It is whether Americans are willing to recognize what this moment reveals about their own government and what kind of country they want reflected back at them by the world. Fires don't stop because we ignore them, and neither does the truth. If this resonated, you're already someone who refuses to look away. Hit subscribe, not for me, for staying informed while it still matters.